Hello and welcome to another Earth Science podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Buss, and this podcast will be talking about Earth's orbit and specifically the Earth, Moon, and Sun system, how the Earth, Moon, and Sun all interact with one another, and specifically we'll talk about solar and lunar eclipse and the tides. So the first slide here is a slide kind of illustrating a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse is when you're going to see the Sun and the Earth with the Moon in between them. So the Moon is between the Sun and the Earth, and that's going to cause the Moon to blot out the Sun if it's just perfectly in line. And the Moon happens to be at the exact same, the right distance from the Earth and also the right size to just perfectly blot out. If the Moon were larger, this wouldn't look as cool. If the Moon were smaller, or if the Moon were further away or closer to us. In the Earth's past, the Moon hasn't been the exact right proportions to do this, and in the future as well, it won't look as cool. But just kind of right now, in our existence, we see a solar eclipse that is a perfect blotting out of the Sun. And it's such an exact thing that, you know, in the image on the right here, the solar eclipse only happens at some places on the Earth. It's not going to be everywhere. So you can kind of see in the left here that it's really only visible for part of the planet. So during a solar eclipse, should be able to see the stars. You know, the stars will come out; they'll be visible when the solar eclipse is occurring for several minutes. All right, here we have an image of a lunar eclipse. For a lunar eclipse, it's actually the Earth that gets between the Sun and the Moon, and lunar eclipses last for hours, and they're not quite as dramatic, so to speak, as a solar eclipse because, you know, the Moon's going to pass into the shadow of the Earth, and it's going to gradually become dimmer, and it'll almost have a little reddish color, and then it'll gradually become whiter again as it goes through Earth's shadow. So that's a lunar eclipse. Alright, so next let's talk about the tides. The tides are basically an effect that all water on the planet experiences. It's just that larger bodies of water, such as oceans, are going to be more dramatic. The Moon, even though it's much smaller than the Sun, the Moon has a greater gravitational effect on the Earth due to its proximity, the fact that it is just closer to the Earth, and the Sun is so much farther away from us. The Moon and the Earth are attracted to each other due to gravitational forces. The Moon doesn't have any water on it, so, you know, the Moon doesn't have any tides, but the Earth has water on its surface, and the water is drawn towards the Moon. Well, it's also experiencing a high tide over here as well on the opposite side of the Earth. And the reason for that is this side of the Earth is experiencing the greatest pull towards the Moon, so there's going to be high tide over here. And this side of the Earth is going to experience the least pull of the Moon, so there's an equal and opposite high tide on the other side of the Earth. And then low tides are going to be experienced at pretty much 90-degree or right angles from the Moon. So high tide, low tide, low tide. Okay, so I mentioned that the Moon has the greatest effect on our tides. Well, the Sun and every body of our object in outer space has some gravitational effect, I suppose, on the Earth, but the Sun is the next biggest pull on the Earth. So the Moon and the Sun both affect the tides of the Earth. So here are a couple examples of extremes. All right, so a neap tide is not as extreme. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's that the Moon and the Sun are at right angles to each other. So the Moon is pulling Earth's oceans this direction, and the Sun is pulling Earth's oceans this direction, and so they kind of cancel each other out a little bit. So you get a less extreme high tide and a less extreme low tide. So the difference between high tide and low tide not as extreme. Alright, well, what about spring tides? Well, spring tides are extreme variations in high tide and low tide. They kind of shouldn't probably be called spring tides because they can happen any time of the year. It's when the Sun and the Moon are in line, and they are both pulling Earth's oceans in the same direction, and so you get a major high tide and a major low tide. Now, you can also they don't have to be next to each other. The Sun can be on one end and the Moon can be over here, and you're going to get this same spring tide because of the fact that you get these twin movements of high tide at either side of the Earth. So, spring tide, extreme tides.